October 1192. The cold winds of the Mediterranean bit at the sails of a lone ship. On board was a man whose name struck terror into the hearts of his enemies and hope into the souls of his subjects. Richard I, King of England, Duke of Normandy, and the legendary Lionheart. But today he was no longer a conqueror. He was a fugitive. Returning from the Third Crusade, Richard had left the Holy Land with a fragile truce, but his journey home would become a nightmare that would reshape the map of Europe. He had not lost a single battle in the East, yet now every sea route and mountain pass was a trap set by those who envied his power. Why was the most powerful king in Christendom running like a thief in the night? Because the world he left behind had changed. In his absence, his younger brother, Prince John, a man whose ambition far outweighed his loyalty, had begun plotting to steal the crown. But John was not alone. King Philip Augustus of France, Richard's former ally turned bitter rival, saw an opportunity. Philip hadn't just forgotten Richard's rejection of his sister's hand in marriage. He was fueled by rumors that Richard was behind the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat. From the courts of Paris to the shadows of London, the wolves were circling. Richard chose to travel incognito, disguised as a humble Templar knight with only 4 attendants. He sailed up the Adriatic, hoping to reach the lands of his brother-in-law, Henry the Lion. But fate, it seemed, was a cruel master. A violent winter storm crashed his ship near Istria. Stranded and forced to travel overland through the territory of his enemies, Richard's disguise eventually crumbled. In December 1192, near Vienna, he was captured by Leopold, Duke of Austria. It was a moment of supreme irony. Years earlier at Acre, Richard had insulted Leopold by throwing his standard into the dirt. Now the Duke of England had the King of England in a cage. The news of Richard's capture sent shockwaves through the Angevin Empire. Emperor Henry handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, while Richard sat in a cold stone cell writing poetry to pass the hours. His kingdom faced total collapse. Emperor Henry demanded a ransom so vast it seemed impossible, 150,000 marks of silver. Back in England, Richard's mother, the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, had to bleed the country dry. A crushing income tax of 25% was imposed on every free man. Churches were stripped of their gold, and the people cried out in despair. But Eleanor knew one thing: without their king, there would be no England. While his brother sat in chains, Prince John saw his moment. He didn't wait for a second coronation. He rushed to the court of King Philip of France. In a dark pact of betrayal, John swore fealty to Philip for Richard's lands in France. Philip, wasting no time, launched a brutal invasion of Normandy. He targeted the great fortress of Gisors, the key to the Vexin region. Through suspicious speed or outright treachery, the fortress fell. Philip was moving through the duchy like a scythe through wheat, burning villages and taking hostages. He believed the lion was dead and the empire was his for the taking. But Philip and John had made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the spirit of the Lionheart. Even from a dungeon, his influence was growing. The imperial nobles were impressed by his courage, and the ransom was being gathered. The devil was about to be unleashed. Join us in Part 2 as the Lionheart returns to reclaim his throne and begins a campaign of vengeance that would leave France in flames.
By the early months of 1194, the impossible had happened. Against all odds, Eleanor of Aquitaine had raised the king's ransom. England was broke, its churches stripped, and its people burdened by taxes, but their king was free. As Richard walked out of his imperial prison, King Philip of France sent a frantic, chilling message to Prince John. It contained only 5 words: "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." The devil was Richard, and he was coming home not with peace in his heart, but with a thirst for justice that would soon scorch the fields of Normandy. In March 1194, Richard's feet finally touched English soil at Sandwich. The reception was rapturous. The people, despite their poverty, cheered for the man who embodied the strength of their nation. But Richard had no time for celebrations. His kingdom was fractured. Prince John's loyalists still held key strongholds like Nottingham and Tickhill. Within weeks, Richard led his forces to these fortresses. He didn't just lay siege, he dismantled the rebellion with such speed and ferocity that John's supporters realized the futility of their cause. The lion was back, and his claws were sharper than ever. To wash away the shame of his captivity, Richard organized a magnificent ceremony at Winchester Cathedral. This was his second coronation. Wearing his glittering crown and robes of state, he stood before his subjects to reaffirm his divine right to rule. It was a clear message to Philip and John. I am not just a survivor, I am your master. But Richard's eyes were already fixed across the English Channel. Normandy was being devoured by Philip's greed. After appointing his loyal advisor, Hubert Walter, to govern England, Richard gathered a massive armada of over 300 ships. By May, he was sailing toward France, ready to reclaim what was stolen. When Richard landed at Barfleur, an unexpected figure was waiting for him. It was Prince John. The man who had plotted his death and stolen his lands now lay prostrate in the dirt, sobbing and begging for forgiveness. The world expected Richard to strike him down. Instead, the Lionheart showed a side of himself rarely seen. He picked his brother up, embraced him, and said, "Have no fear. You are a child who had bad advisors." It was a calculated act of mercy. Richard knew that a forgiven John would be a useful weapon against Philip. To prove his new loyalty, John immediately turned on his former French allies, slaughtering the garrison Philip had given him at Évre. The war for Normandy had truly begun. Philip was currently besieging the town of Verneuil, confident in his numbers. But Richard didn't follow the traditional rules of warfare. He relied on lightning speed and psychological terror. As Richard's army approached, Philip heard rumors of the Lionheart's arrival. The French king, remembered for his cautious and calculating nature, felt a wave of panic. He didn't wait for a clash. He abandoned the siege under the cover of night, leaving behind his heavy artillery and supplies. Richard walked into Verneuil not as the conqueror of a battle, but as a predator whose mere presence forced his enemies to flee. Richard had secured England and frightened Philip into a retreat, but the war was far from over. The great fortresses of Gisors and the Vexin were still in French hands. Philip was regrouping, and Richard was preparing a stroke that would capture the very archives of the French monarchy. Join us in Part 3 as the two kings meet on the battlefield and a royal baggage train becomes the ultimate prize in this Game of Thrones.
The year 1194 was turning into a masterclass in warfare. King Philip of France had expected a weakened Richard, a king broken by his years in a German dungeon. Instead, he faced a whirlwind. Richard didn't just march, he struck with the speed of a desert hawk. After forcing Philip to abandon the siege of Verneuil, Richard turned his eyes southward toward the lower valley. His goal was simple: dismantle Philip's influence piece by piece and reclaim the strategic territories of Touraine and Anjou. Richard moved with a ferocity that stunned the French garrisons. He arrived at Tours, and the city authorities, trembling at his reputation, handed over a massive payment to spare their lives. But Richard wasn't just after money, he was after total dominance. He pushed further to Loches, a formidable castle held by French forces. Richard didn't settle into a months-long siege. He launched an immediate, brutal assault and took the fortress by storm. Every victory sent a message to the local lords who had betrayed him. The rightful king had returned, and the price of treason would be paid in blood and fire. By July 1194, Philip Augustus had regrouped and moved his army to Vendôme. He believed he had finally lured Richard into a decisive trap. Philip sent word that he would attack the very next morning, but when the sun rose over the woods of Fredival, the French camp was in chaos. Philip, realizing that Richard's army was positioned far better than he had anticipated, ordered a sudden and frantic retreat. The calculated French king was running again. But this time, Richard the Lionheart would not let him go so easily. Richard unleashed his cavalry. Leading the charge was his trusted mercenary captain, Mercadier. They crashed into the French rearguard in the Fredival woods. Philip Augustus barely escaped with his life, galloping away as Richard's knights nipped at his heels. But while Philip escaped, his legacy did not. Richard's forces captured the entire French royal baggage train. It was a victory beyond measure. They found Philip's tents, his horses, and his treasure. But most importantly, they found the royal archives, Philip's secret ledgers, his tax records, and the names of every spy and turncoat noble who had secretly taken French gold to betray Richard. Richard sat in his tent, laughing as he read the names of the men who had plotted against him while he was in captivity. This was a psychological blow from which Philip would never fully recover. For a medieval king, losing your royal seal and archives was the ultimate humiliation. Richard used this information to purge his lands of traitors, while Philip was forced to sign a humiliating truce on July 23rd, just to stop the bleeding. The Lionheart had not only won the battle, he had stolen the French king's secrets, leaving Philip exposed and desperate. Richard was now unassailable. He had reclaimed his lands, humiliated his rival, and secured the documents that could destroy his enemies from within. But Philip was a survivor, and he still held the crown jewel of Normandy, Gisors. To counter this, Richard would begin building his most famous creation, a fortress so powerful it was called the Saucy Castle. Join us in Part 4 as we witness the birth of Chateau Gaillard and the escalation of a war that would push both kings to the brink of madness.
After the disaster at Fredival, King Philip was wounded but not defeated. He still held the massive fortress of Gisors, the traditional gateway into Normandy. For Richard, as long as Philip held Gisors, the heart of his empire was vulnerable. But the truce of 1194 was a fragile thing, a thin veil of peace over a boiling cauldron of hatred. Richard knew he couldn't just wait for Philip to strike again. He needed a new shield, a bastion so formidable that no French army would ever dare to pass. He found his answer on a high rocky cliff overlooking the river Seine, at a place called Lionheart. Building a fortress at Lionheart was a declaration of war, not just against Philip, but against the church. The land belonged to the Archbishop of Rouen, who forbid Richard from building there. But the Lionheart was not a man to be told no. He seized the land, ignored the Archbishop's excommunications, and began a construction project the likes of which the medieval world had never seen. Richard wasn't just the financier, he was the lead architect. He used the advanced engineering secrets he had learned from the massive Crusader castles in the Holy Land to design a masterpiece of stone and defiance. In just 2 years, a blink of an eye for medieval construction, the fortress rose from the rock. Richard called it Chateau Gaillard, or the Saucy Castle. It was a marvel of military architecture. Unlike traditional square keeps, Richard designed its walls with a unique corrugated pattern, a series of rounded towers that left no blind spots for attackers and made the walls nearly immune to battering rams. He spent nearly £20,000 on its construction, more than he had spent on all his other castles combined. Standing on the battlements, Richard looked toward Paris and boasted, "I could hold this castle, even if its walls were made of butter." Chateau Gaillard was more than a defensive wall. It was a dagger pointed directly at Philip's throat. It blocked the river route to Rouen and served as a massive base where Richard could gather his armies for a strike on Paris. Philip was furious.
He reportedly shouted that he would take the castle even if its walls were made of iron. Richard's response was swift and characteristic, "And I would hold it even if they were made of fat." The verbal sparring was over. In 1197, the truce shattered, and the war reignited with a level of cruelty that shocked even the hardened soldiers of the era. This was no longer a war of chivalry, it was a war of terror. Both kings began blinding and mutilating prisoners to instill dread in the enemy. Philip burned the town of Dieppe to the ground using Greek fire, while Richard's mercenary captain, Mercadier, ravaged the French countryside like a plague. But while the land suffered, the strategic balance was shifting. Richard secured a vital alliance with Baldwin, the Count of Flanders, effectively surrounding Philip. Suddenly, the French king found himself facing a nightmare: an English king in the west, a Flemish army in the north, and a German emperor in the east who was Richard's own nephew. The walls of Château Gaillard stood as silent witnesses to the carnage below. Richard had built his shield, and now he was ready to use his sword. Philip was backed into a corner, his kingdom shrinking and his allies deserting him. But the greatest clash was yet to come. Join us in Part 5 as the two kings meet for the final bloody showdown at the Battle of Gisors, where a bridge would collapse and a king would nearly drown in the mud.
The year was 1198. The fragile peace between the two greatest monarchs of Europe had evaporated into the smoke of burning villages. King Richard's strategic masterpiece, Château Gaillard, was now complete, and the balance of power had tipped decisively in his favor. Philip Augustus was desperate. He launched a frantic offensive into the Vexin, burning and looting, trying to reclaim the momentum. But Richard the Lionheart was not just waiting behind his stone walls. He was patrolling the borders like a hungry predator, waiting for Philip to make a single fatal mistake. In late September, Richard struck. He launched a lightning-fast counterattack, capturing the fortresses of Courcelles and Boury. Philip, hearing that Courcelles was under threat but believing the garrison was still holding out, rushed to its relief. He rode at the head of several hundred elite knights and a host of infantry. But Philip was walking into a nightmare. He didn't realize that Richard's army was much closer than his scouts had reported. As Philip's exhausted force arrived near Courcelles, they didn't find a battle in progress. They found a ruin occupied by the English. Suddenly, from the tree lines, the sky darkened with English crossbow bolts. Then came the thunder of hooves. Richard himself led the charge. He was a whirlwind of steel. Later, Richard would boast in his letters that he unhorsed 3 French knights with a single lance before it finally shattered. The French force, caught in the open and unprepared for a pitched battle, broke almost immediately. This was not a clash of armies, it was a rout. Panic seized the French ranks. Philip Augustus, seeing his guard being cut down, turned his horse and fled toward the safety of the great fortress of Gisors. The chase covered miles. Richard and his knights were literally at the heels of the French king. Philip reached the gates of Gisors, but there was one final obstacle: the bridge over the river Epte. As the mass of panicked French knights, heavy with armor and horses, crowded onto the narrow bridge, the wooden structure groaned under the impossible weight. Then came a sickening crack. The bridge collapsed. Philip Augustus, the King of France, was plunged into the dark, cold waters of the Epte, along with scores of his finest knights. While his knights drowned around him in their heavy plate armor, Philip struggled for his life, gasping for air and swallowing the muddy water of the Epte. Richard, watching from the riverbank, didn't offer a hand. Instead, he watched with giddy glee, mockingly telling his companions that the French king was finally getting a good drink after his hard ride. Somehow, Philip's remaining guards managed to haul him out of the muck and drag him behind the iron gates of Gisors. Philip survived, but his dignity was buried in the mud. He had lost 100 of his best knights and 200 horses. Richard had turned the French monarchy into a laughing stock.
The Battle of Gisors was the ultimate humiliation for Philip Augustus. Richard had proven, once and for all, who was the true master of the battlefield. But even as the Lionheart stood at the peak of his glory, the shadows of destiny were moving. In the south, a small castle and a mysterious treasure would soon change everything. Join us in Part 6 as we witness the beginning of the end. A stray arrow, a stubborn siege, and the wound that would do what Philip's armies never could. By early 1199, Richard the Lionheart was at the zenith of his power. He had reclaimed his lands, built the world's most advanced fortress, and literally dragged King Philip of France through the mud. A 5-year truce had been signed, and Richard was finally preparing for what he loved most, returning to the Holy Land to finish what he started at Jerusalem. But first, he had to settle a minor rebellion in the south, in the region of Limousin. It was supposed to be a simple mopping-up operation, a small distraction before his grand return to the east. The target was Châlus-Chabrol, a small, insignificant castle belonging to a rebellious lord. Rumors had reached Richard that a great treasure, a hoard of Roman gold, had been found on the grounds. While the treasure was likely just a legend, Richard was determined to punish his insolent vassals. The castle was so small that it was defended by only 38 people, including women and children. Richard, the man who had commanded tens of thousands at Acre and Jaffa, arrived with his elite mercenary army. He expected the gates to open within hours. He was wrong. The defenders of Châlus knew they were doomed, but they fought with the desperation of cornered animals. On the evening of March 26th, Richard was walking around the castle perimeter, inspecting the progress of his sappers. In a display of his characteristic fearlessness, or perhaps arrogance, he wasn't wearing his full armor. He carried only a light shield. On the castle walls, a lone defender was seen using a frying pan as a makeshift shield, firing bolts from a crossbow at anyone who moved. Richard, a veteran of 100 battles, saw it coming and ducked behind his shield, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The arrow struck him in the shoulder, near the neck. To any other man, it would have been a painful wound. To a king, it was a nuisance. Richard walked back to his tent, refusing to show any sign of weakness. But as the surgeons tried to remove the bolt in the dim light of a torch, they made a fatal error. They pulled the shaft out, but the iron head remained buried deep in the king's flesh. Within days, the wound turned black. Gangrene, the silent killer of the Middle Ages, began to spread through the massive Richard frame. As the lion lay dying in his tent, the castle of Châlus finally fell. The archer who had shot him, a man named Pierre Bazile, was brought before the king's bed. Richard, in a final act of chivalry that shocked his commanders, ordered the man to be set free and given 100 shillings. "Live on," Richard reportedly said, "although you have taken my life." It was the mercy of a dying king, but it would not be honored by his grieving soldiers. The Lionheart was fading. The man who had survived the deserts of Palestine and the dungeons of Germany was being brought down by a single rusty arrow in a nameless field. As his breath grew shallow, the future of the Angevin Empire hung in the balance. Join us in the final Part 7 as we witness the death of a legend, the dark rise of King John, and the ultimate fall of the empire Richard worked so hard to build.
April 6th, 1199. Inside a darkened tent outside the walls of Châlus, the air was thick with the smell of incense and death. Richard I, the King of England, lay dying at the age of 41. His mother, the 80-year-old Eleanor of Aquitaine, held his hand, watching the light fade from the eyes of her favorite son. The man who had survived the spears of Saladin and the treachery of emperors was losing his final battle to a microscopic enemy, gangrene. As the sun set, the Lionheart breathed his last, and with him, the golden age of the Angevin Empire began to crumble.
Richard's death was as dramatic as his life. Following his wishes, his body was divided. His brain was buried at Châlus. His heart, the legendary Lion's Heart, was entombed at Rouen in Normandy, and the rest of his body was laid at the feet of his father, Henry II, at Fontevraud Abbey. Even in death, Richard was a strategist. He wanted his remains to guard the territories he had fought so hard to defend. But stone and stone cannot lead an army. As news of his death spread, a cold shiver ran through England and Normandy. The lion was gone, and the child, Prince John, was now the king. Prince John, the man Richard had once called a child with bad advisors, finally had the crown he had craved for so long. But John was no Richard. He lacked the military genius, the charisma, and the ironclad loyalty of the Lionheart's generals. King Philip Augustus of France, upon hearing of Richard's death, reportedly breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that with Richard gone, the greatest obstacle to his dream of a united France had vanished. Philip didn't waste a moment. He began to test the new King of England, and John, true to his nature, began to stumble. Within just 5 years of Richard's death, the disaster was complete. Philip Augustus launched a massive invasion of Normandy. He didn't face the lightning-fast counterattacks of the Lionheart. Instead, he faced John's indecision and paranoia. Even Richard's butter-walled masterpiece, Château Gaillard, couldn't save an empire led by a weak king. In 1204, after a brutal siege, the saucy castle fell to the French. One by one, Richard's lands, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Brittany, were swallowed by the French crown. The Angevin Empire, built by the blood of heroes, was dismantled by the failures of a brother. History has judged Richard the Lionheart in many ways. To some, he was a neglectful king who spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. To others, he was the ultimate knight-errant, a man of unmatched courage and chivalry. But one thing is certain: while he lived, the world trembled at his name. He was the only man who could look Saladin in the eye and command his respect. He was the only man who could turn a bridge collapse into a comedy and a prison cell into a throne. Richard didn't just rule a kingdom, he became a myth that has survived for over 800 years. The lion may have fallen, but his roar still echoes through the corridors of history. From the desert sands of the East to the rocky cliffs of the Seine, the legend of Richard I remains as solid as the stones of Château Gaillard. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through the life of the Lionheart. If you enjoyed this series on the Lost Empires, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Until next time, remember, empires may fall, but legends never die.